No one expected a calm morning at the zoo to turn into a moment that left the entire country holding its breath. A massive grizzly suddenly broke free, sending crowds running in panic. Yet in the middle of all that chaos, an elderly woman, almost 80, stood perfectly still, as if she'd been waiting for the very animal charging toward her. No one understood why she didn't run, and even fewer could imagine that this encounter would uncover a secret buried for 30 years, a secret powerful enough to bring tears to anyone who heard it. The loudspeaker shattered the quiet like a cracked bell. "Code Amber, Grizzly Bear at large, lockdown. This is not a drill." On a crisp autumn morning at Sierra Gate Wildlife Park, the paths that usually smelled of kettle corn and pine needles erupted into a rush of feet and stifled screams. Strollers knocked against benches. Paper maps fluttered across the boardwalk like frightened birds. A toddler's sock went missing in the crowd. Radios crackled with overlapping orders. Somewhere past the aspens, a low siren moaned and then found its pitch, rising and falling over the foothills. He appeared with a deliberate certainty that shrank the noise to a distant hum. The bear, massive, silver frosting his shoulder hump, the slow roll of age in his gait, stepped from shadow into hard sun. The tag on his ear, scratched and dulled by years, still caught a thin glint of light. He moved as if he'd chosen this path long before dawn, as if every footfall had been decided in a dream he didn't fully remember until now. "Eyes on the grizzly! Sector Cedar!" a young voice shouted into a handheld. Ethan Miller, new badge, new boots, streak of panic whitening his knuckles, pivoted toward the boardwalk. "I need authorization to deploy." His words came out too fast, the way a heart stutters when it hears itself. "Hold," said a woman's voice over the radio, even and low, the kind of voice that belongs to people who measure disasters in minutes and then lay them out on clipboards. Dr. Valerie Brooks, Park Director. "Do not fire unless he breaks line towards civilians. Teams establish a soft barrier. Cameras up. I want eyes from Cedar to Owl Ridge." Civilians were already breaking every which way. A man in a ball cap dragged a teen by the sleeve. A cluster of middle schoolers poured past a snack stand, dropping a paper tray of curly fries like a breadcrumb trail for birds that would never come. Phones rose above heads. In the jitter of a live stream, the world narrowed to a trembling rectangle. A gray-brown shape behind sunflare, a hand in the foreground, chat bubbles stacking with a kind of hungry awe. In the middle of the path, where the boardwalk widened to let tour groups drift around the gift shop like a slow river, an elderly woman in a wool coat paused her careful progress and then simply stopped. She leaned on a dark wooden cane, polished by years of palms and weather, the curve fitting her hand as if it had grown there. Her hair, white and soft as thistledown, lifted in the light breeze. Helen Ward did not run. She didn't even step back. She turned her face toward the bear, the way a person turns toward a familiar sound that takes a moment to place. A mother, flushed and frantic, tried to steer her aside. "Ma'am, please, this way." The plea hit the air and vanished. Helen's eyes never left the animal. Around her, bodies surged like tide around a rock, and in that sudden space, the morning felt briefly, strangely still. The bear stopped at the end of a line of quaking aspens. He lifted his head, parted his jaws, and tasted the air. His breath rose visible for an instant, a pale ribbon against the sun. Then he took 2 heavy, measured steps down the boardwalk, claws nicking the wood with the sound of a key dragged across a desk. He did not look at the nearest trash can, did not tilt toward the quail exhibit, did not flare at the clatter of a dropped soda bottle. His eyes, neither glassy nor wild, tracked the old woman standing alone as if nothing else in the world existed. Ethan slid sideways, trying to put himself between the bear and what his training called the vulnerable subject, but the current of fleeing bodies washed him against the rail. "Director, he's vectoring on a civilian. I'm in position." He raised the dart rifle, hands trembling, barrel settling, breath jerking. "Ethan?" Brooks's voice cut clean through the headset chatter. "Safety on. Watch what he's doing, not what you fear he'll do." A little boy separated from his father pinwheeled toward the boardwalk edge and stumbled to his knees. The bear's head swung, a slow tick of attention. A pair of screams tore out of the crowd. But the animal shifted his weight minutely and stepped wide, tracing an invisible arc that spared the boy by a yard, like a seasoned hiker leaving a fawn sleeping in grass. He did not hurry. He did not bluff, charge. He simply kept on. The live stream camera pushed in, hands shaking, the breath of the person behind it ragged and too close to the mic. He's going to the old lady," the streamer whispered, though the audio didn't need a whisper to feel true. 1,000 strangers on phones leaned closer in kitchens and waiting rooms. In the time it takes to blink, the count trembling at the corner of the screen multiplied. From the control room, Brooks stood over a wall of monitors, each frame a slightly different angle of the same impossible geometry. Weight and age and memory, crossing a public path toward a woman who had chosen stillness over flight. "Zoom on the muzzle," she told a tech. "Look at his mouth, lips relaxed, no gape. Look at his ears, forward, then neutral. He's not in defensive high." She didn't blink. "He's orienting, on something he knows." Helen heard the crowd like surf heard from far inland, a rumor of waves. She felt the boards beneath her shoes and the familiar pressure at the top of her cane, and beneath the cool air a thread of ascent rose to meet her, threading through the clamor, sap and dust, and the faintest ghost of cedar soap from a morning long gone. Her heart knocked once, hard, in her chest. The bear's shoulders lifted with his breath. The sunlight caught the silver in his fur like frost in September grass. "Ma'am, please," Ethan said, his voice thinner now that he was close enough to see her age in the soft, papered lines around her mouth, the blue of her eyes, clear and stubborn as sky. "We can move now. We should move now." Helen's fingers warmed the cane's handle. "I hear you," she said gently, and her voice, worn but steady, seemed to settle even the air. "But I'm right where I ought to be." The bear closed the distance by another careful step. Someone sobbed, someone prayed. Somewhere metal knocked metal as a gate shut downrange. A Canada jay, irreverent and bright, dropped to a rail post and cocked its head at the tableau, then shot away, a streak of gray and white. "Hold your lines," Brooks said, and the team, good at obedience when clear instructions met the gravity of a moment, held. "No heroics. Give him room. Everyone breathe." The bear's head tilted, the way a question tilts, and a soft sound, lower than a growl, higher than a moan, rose from his chest, the kind of sound that doesn't threaten so much as ask. He swiveled one ear, as if listening for a reply he had traveled years to finally hear. The boards under his weight murmured. He lifted a paw and set it down with care, claws chinking the wood like a metronome, marking a slow, inevitable measure. Ethan's sight picture floated and steadied. He could feel the old woman's nearness, the way one senses a lit candle in a dim room. He didn't know why he said what he said next. He didn't even plan it. "Director," he breathed, "I don't think he's after her." Brooks didn't answer right away. In the control room, a ripple of silence moved across the staff like a benediction. She watched the bear watch the woman. She watched the woman lift her chin the barest fraction, as though deciding to recognize someone she hadn't seen in years and yet had never not known. She watched the space between them become a living thing, old and stubborn and utterly beyond her clipboard. On the live stream, the chat sprinted and stuttered. Hearts floated, warnings flashed. In the real world, a feather of wind lifted the hem of Helen's coat and brushed it against her legs. The bear drew breath and released it, a quiet huff. Helen's hand softened on the cane. The moment found its center. "Easy," Brooke said, to her team or to the morning itself. No one could tell. Everyone. Easy. The bear took one more step. Helen's lips parted, and though the cameras were close and the microphones were many, what she said rode the air no farther than the distance. Between her and the animal, the crowd held, the radio stayed clear. The siren, tired of its own alarm, wound down to a low, miserable whine and stopped. He was not charging. She was not fleeing. The world, built for panic and velocity, had to make room for something else. And as the first shadow of a passing cloud dimmed the boardwalk, the day leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen when a very old animal and a very old woman finally reached the place they had each, in their own way, been walking toward. The bear's breath made a soft white ribbon in the cool air, and with that small thread of warmth, something tugged loose in Helen's mind. One stitch, then another. The boardwalk, the siren, the phones lifted like periscopes dropped away, and a different wind came in, raw and sharp, the way Wyoming can be when winter outruns the calendar. 30 years earlier, the night had arrived with a hard edge. Snow came slantwise across the two-lane, gusting and clinging to the fence wire so that every post wore a white cap by midnight. The call reached the rescue station as a frantic jumble. Rancher on the line, sow down in a ravine, tracks of something small circling and circling in the drifts. Helen put on the same wool coat she wore now, younger then by a life and a half, the elbows not yet shiny, the collar still thick. Mark Lyons, deputy with a kind face and a permanent sunburn, swung the truck around and said, "We'll be careful," and meant it. They followed the rancher's tail lights into the dark until the truck could go no farther. The wind took their words and snapped them like flags. Down in the shallow cut lay the sow, old, perhaps poisoned, perhaps just done. A puddle of fur nosed at her, keening in a voice that didn't belong to winter. Helen slid on her knees the last yard, set her gloved hand against the cub's ribs, felt the stutter of a cold engine. "You're much too small to be out here," she said, though the wind made a mockery of conversation. She tucked the cub inside her coat, against her sweater, under the old scarf that smelled faintly of cedar soap. For hours, in the cab with the heater wheezing and Mark tapping the defrost, she did the old miracle, body heat and patience. The little mouth searched, complained, quieted. When at last the trembling gave way to sleep, she laughed and cried the short, tired laughter of someone whose hands have been useful. "Bruno," she said to the sleeping face, because a name sometimes can anchor a life. What followed, that first week, was a schedule that would have shamed a newborn. Every 3 hours, bottle warmed in a pan, rubber nipple tested against her wrist, the cub's paws patting at her sleeve with a seriousness beyond his size. He learned her smell before he learned light. Pine, wool, a little coffee, that soft ghost of cedar. He cried like any baby at 2 a.m. She sang old county hymns off-key because the room was quiet enough to hear her own heart, and it comforted her to know it still kept time. Mark built a pen with a top because bears climb before they walk like they mean it. Then he built a second, taller one because the first taught Bruno only the joy of trying. "Your trouble," Helen would say, and the cub would mouth her finger with all the ferocity of wet felt. When his claws got big enough to catch her skin, she yelped once, dramatically, a touch of theater, and he blinked and placed his paw on her wrist with the bewildered care of a child who has just discovered he is strong. After that, he learned to aim his play at the blanket, and not at her. 8 months carried them forward, the way seasons will when you're busy counting feedings and measuring weight on a bulky scale. The day he knocked over the kitchen chair and then looked mortified about it, Mark said softly, "He's outgrowing us." Helen had known before anyone said it. Food costs and enclosure specs and the long math of a life that could stretch another 25 years. Love never paid those bills. Sierra Gate Wildlife Park agreed to take him. They had space and a vet tech who knew grizzlies, and a plan with boxes and signatures that made a kind of sense if you didn't have to carry any of it in your chest. The transfer day smelled like warm hay and the sadness that comes from having done the right thing. Bruno fought the crate not with rage, but with confusion. A baby's longing for the shirt he slept on, the night noises he knew, the woman who hummed without realizing it. Helen leaned close to the grate until Mark touched her elbow as a reminder that skin through bars is a risk, and also because he knew goodbyes can make you forget your own rules. "I'll come back for you," she told the small, blunt face. "I promise." She said it twice, because some promises require echo. Life has a way of taking the clean line you drew on paper and laying weather across it. Her husband's heart went sideways that spring. 3 days of ICU beeping and warm washcloths on a forehead that had never learned to rest. After the funeral came the quiet, the heavy kind that puts weight on chairs and makes the house sound like it's holding its breath. Then came the diagnosis, the word that rattles around the kitchen cupboards and never sits down. She did her rounds between the clinic and the chemo unit and the grocery in between because soup has to be bought and life insists on its small chores even when the big ones roar. She wrote letters to Sierra Gate and didn't mail them. She took a bus ticket as far as the front of her purse, then folded it and used it as a bookmark in a field guide she didn't finish. When the first remission came, she thought, "I will go now," but the savings account tin on the pantry shelf had more air than cash. Time can be cruelest in how ordinary it feels as it leaves. None of us notice a step is a step until our knees ache. Years turned. Sierra Gate pressed postcards every winter with photographs of animals against cardboard snow. Bruno grew in them from fluff to the sturdy, big-shouldered version of himself that any stranger would read as bear, and only one woman would read as boy. Sometimes she held those cards at the kitchen window and said, "You look good," and imagined the run of his breath, the way he would nose the seam of her coat for the fleece string he used to chew until she tugged it away with mock outrage. On the morning Colorado decided to put its sharp blue sky on display, she woke with a steadiness she had not felt in years. She oiled her hands, habit for the joints that complained these days, and the old cedar scent rose and laid itself where a pulse belongs. She took the cane because dignity often travels easier when it has a bit of help. She did not tell anyone at church or the pharmacist. Some journeys are smaller when shared, and this one needed to be as large as it felt. Halfway to Sierra Gate, a talk radio host in Denver cut to breaking news, a lockdown at the park. She turned the volume down and kept going, the way a person will when a destination is older than the day. By the time she reached the entrance and paid the reduced senior fee with bills folded twice, the siren had already begun its weary rise and fall. The guard's hands fluttered. People ran. Someone urged her shoulder to turn. She moved forward in the simple geometry of someone who has remembered a promise and found a breath to keep it. On a side street, not 3 miles away, Mark Lyons parked his cruiser crooked as a boot heel and stared at the live feed on his phone. The old wool coat, the cane, the bear. He said Helen once, quietly to nobody at all, then got back in and headed toward the park, because history sometimes asks a witness to show up. And here she was, on the boardwalk, the winter in her bones, meeting the winter in his fur. She smelled the cedar, faint and faithful. He lifted his head as if the air had given him a word he had been trying to remember since childhood. Behind them, Colorado held its pose of bright mountains and distant weather. Ahead of them, trouble menaced and then receded like a wave that cannot quite make shore. The promise from a warm kitchen, spoken through wire and worry 3 decades ago, uncoiled across the space between them like a bridge you don't know you've built until you step onto it. In the control room, Dr. Brooks watched 2 old lives find each other in a place built for schedules and signs. On the boardwalk, Ethan steadied his hands without being told why. In the crowd, a child stopped crying and simply watched. The bear took a breath that sounded like the start of a song. Helen lifted her chin and let memory finish drawing the map it had begun long before this bright morning, when a cold little heart worked itself warm against her sweater and learned what a home could smell like. For a long moment, neither Helen nor the bear moved, the world around. Them held its breath the way a congregation does when the hymn ends a beat too soon. The wind shifted, just a little, and carried a ghost of cedar from Helen's coat into the open air. The grizzly paused, his ears tilted forward. Something ancient and tender flickered behind his dark eyes, like an ember waking under ash. Bruno took a single slow step toward her. The boardwalk trembled under his weight, a low wooden groan that made several people yelp and shove backward. Ethan froze with his hand still hovering near the dart rifle's trigger guard, but his finger did not curl. The live stream camera zoomed in shakily. Thousands of strangers watching from kitchens and break rooms felt the same strange quiet that had settled over the park. The bear made that sound again, a soft, rumbling woof, not a warning but a greeting. The same noise he'd made long ago when his paws were still too big for his stride, when he'd toddle across Helen's kitchen floor and press his cold nose into her elbow. It was the kind of sound you don't forget if it ever belonged to you. Helen felt her breath catch in her throat. Her hand tightened around the carved handle of the cane. "Bruno," she whispered, her voice thin but unshaken. "Baby, is that you?" The bear's head lowered, an unmistakable sign of trust. His enormous shoulders slackened, and his mouth softened into an expression that no handbook on wildlife behavior had ever bothered to describe. He approached not like a predator, but like a creature who had once depended entirely on the woman standing in front of him. Dr. Brooks, watching from the control room, leaned in toward the monitor. "There," she murmured. "Look at his gait. He's not stalking. He's orienting to a familiar scent." Her team gathered behind her, silent except for the hum of equipment. One technician replayed a clip from the moment the bear escaped. Bruno had ignored every sound, every human, every smell, until Helen stepped through the park's front gate. Only then had he lifted his head, sniffed the air, and paced the length of his enclosure with rising urgency. "He picked up her scent," Brooks said, awe creeping into her usually even tone. "He recognized it." "After 30 years?" a staff member whispered. "After 30 years," Brooks confirmed. Out on the boardwalk, the wind eased as if nature itself had decided not to interfere. The bear came to a stop only a few feet from Helen. His breath came in slow clouds. His claws clicked once on the wood as he adjusted his stance, careful, deliberate, almost gentle. A child from the crowd called out, "Is he going to hug her?" And his mother hushed him instantly, fear cracking her voice. But the wild tension that had gripped the park minutes before had shifted into something else, something older than fear, something waiting. Helen lifted her free hand. Her fingers trembled, but she did not lower them. Bruno leaned forward, inhaling the scent of her skin, her coat, her hair. Another soft rumble rose in his chest. He nudged her palm with his nose, just lightly, the way he used to nudge the bottle when he was hungry. Gasps scattered through the crowd. Someone began to sob. Even Ethan, who had been braced for disaster since the first alarm had sounded, felt his throat tighten. Dr. Brooks lifted the radio to her mouth. "No one fires," she said, "not unless I say otherwise. He's not attacking. He's—" She watched Bruno press his massive forehead into Helen's hand. "Remembering." A tremor of emotion moved through Helen. Her eyes filled as she stroked the rough fur between his ears, the fur that once had been nothing but downy fluff against her chest. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "you grew so big." Behind her, someone's camera slipped from their grasp and hit the ground. The sound made Bruno shift his weight, but he didn't look away from her. His focus was absolute, as if the 30 years between them had been a long night, and the dawn had finally come. Ethan's radio startled with static, then a new voice came through, measured, academic, but strained with excitement. "This is Dr. Samuel Pierce from the University of Colorado. I'm en route. Director Brooks, I'd like permission to study this interaction. This is unprecedented in Ursidae behavior." Brooks answered without taking her eyes off the screen. "Permission granted, but stay clear when you arrive. We're working on minutes, not miracles." Dr. Pierce continued, "If he remembers her, if he's responding to imprinting from infancy, this could redefine long-term memory capacity in grizzlies." Brooks nodded slowly. Yes, it could. But science was a distant drum compared to the heartbeat happening on that boardwalk. Helen leaned closer, her breath frosting the air near Bruno's jowls. "I never forgot you," she whispered. "Not one day." Bruno chuffed again, a softer sound, as if he were answering. Then, with a surprising delicacy for a creature his size, he brushed the side of his face against her coat. The motion nearly made her lose her balance, but she steadied herself with the cane and let her hand travel up the ridge of his skull. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "He's hugging her," someone said, disbelief warming into amazement. It would have been a perfect moment, too perfect maybe, if not for what happened next. Ethan noticed it first, the way Bruno's breathing hitched, shallow and strained, the way his back legs trembled the slightest bit, the way he paused to swallow, as though something inside him was heavier than his size could hide. "Director," Ethan said into the radio, "something's off with his respiration." Brooks frowned. "Define off. He's laboring. Look at his flank." On the monitor, she saw it too, the uneven rise and fall, the stiffness in his joints. Not age alone, not stress alone. Something medical. "Get the vet team ready," she ordered, "but keep them back until I say. No equipment noise." Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, "Director, I think he's sick." Helen didn't hear. Or maybe she did, but the truth had already taken root in her without needing to be spoken aloud. She felt the heaviness in his breath. She remembered the letters she never sent, the years she didn't visit, the promises she couldn't keep. And beneath all of that, she felt something deeper still, an intuition carved by decades of loving creatures who could not speak with words. She laid her hand gently on his cheek. "Honey," she murmured, voice breaking, "how long have you been hurting?" Bruno answered not with sound, but by leaning his full weight into her, slowly, carefully, as if offering his burden instead of asking her to take it. The crowd saw a miracle. Brooke saw a behavioral anomaly. Ethan saw a wild animal trusting a human more than it trusted its own instincts. But Helen saw something else entirely. She saw a farewell that had begun long before this morning. And as the bear pressed his head into her shoulder, seeking comfort from the only person who had ever held him as a child, she knew, with the unmistakable clarity that age brings, that time had finally caught both of them. Bruno was dying, and so was she. But for now, just for this fragile, shimmering moment, they were together again. Bruno stayed pressed against Helen long after the first wave of shock passed through the crowd, long after the radios quieted, and the live-stream comments blurred into an unreadable river. He rested his massive head against her shoulder as if he had walked 30 years just for this moment, because in a way, he had. When he finally shifted his weight, it was only to follow her slow steps as the staff created a path for them, a living corridor of wonder and disbelief. Dr. Brooks walked beside them, her voice hushed, even though no one had asked for silence. "We'll move them to the observation room. It's safer and quieter." Her eyes softened as she added, "For both of them." Inside the veterinary wing, the lights had been dimmed and thick pads laid across the floor. No metal tables, no restraints, nothing that would remind Bruno of cages or cold procedures. The bear entered behind Helen, brushing her coat with his shoulder to make sure she didn't stumble on the small step. When she eased herself into a cushion on the floor, he circled once, slow, stiff, and then lay down beside her with a long exhale that sounded like relief. Dr. Samuel Pierce arrived minutes later, breathless from the sprint across the park. He paused at the door, struck motionless by the sight. An elderly woman leaning her head against the neck of a dying grizzly, her frail hand smoothing the coarse fur as though she were petting the same cub she once held under wool blankets. "My God," Pierce whispered, "this shouldn't be possible." Brooks answered quietly, "And yet, here we are." Hours slipped by, measured only by the softness of their breathing and the occasional rumble from Bruno that vibrated through the floor. Helen talked to him in a low, soothing tone, stories from the past, memories he might not understand, but surely felt. She told him about her husband, about the years she spent alone, about the mornings she woke thinking she could still hear a cub whining from a nest of blankets near the wood stove. "Those were good days," she murmured, her palm resting on the ridge of his great shoulder. "The best ones, really. You gave me purpose when I needed it most." Bruno shifted, nudging her hand with his snout, as if acknowledging every word. As evening deepened, the medical team delivered the results of the emergency exam. Kidney failure, advanced, irreversible. Pain managed only by strong medication, time measured not in months, but perhaps weeks. Brooks knelt beside Helen. "He doesn't have long," she said, her voice careful, gentle. "We'll keep him comfortable. And if you want to be here with him every day, we'll make arrangements." Helen smiled, tired but determined. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not this time." And she didn't. She came every morning in a small shuttle the staff arranged, wrapped in the same wool coat, leaning heavily on her cane. Some days she walked into the room on her own. Other days she needed assistance. But Bruno always knew when she arrived. He would lift his head, ears perked, and let out that same soft rumble he once used as a cub. Staff who had worked there 20 years swore they had never seen anything like it. Live streams of the initial encounter spread across the country, and soon letters arrived at the park. Handwritten notes, drawings from children, stories from people who had once loved an animal and never got to say goodbye. Many addressed Helen by name, though she never saw the broadcasts. She only smiled when Brooks told her about them. "People remember love when they see it," Helen said. "That's all this is." By December, snow blanketed the foothills outside the park. The windows of the observation room fogged with the warmth of the bear's breath and the hum of the space heater they added for Helen. Bruno moved slowly now, each motion deliberate, every breath an effort. His eyes stayed on her even when he was too weak to lift his head. One afternoon, as snow pushed against the window panes, Helen's breathing grew shallow. She lay back on a padded cot, her hand still resting in the thick fur near his cheek. Nurses checked her vitals, their faces betraying what their professionalism tried to hide. She looked at Dr. Brooks and whispered, It's close, isn't it? Brooks nodded once, tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. Do you want the room cleared? No, Helen answered, turning her gaze to Bruno. But let me be next to him. The staff arranged, cushions on the floor. Carefully, reverently, they moved Helen into place beside the bear. Bruno, despite his weakness, shifted toward her, wrapping as much of his body around hers as he could. He laid his head across her chest, just as he used to years ago, when he crawled into her lap, seeking warmth. Helen's voice was barely audible now. "Thank you," she whispered, "for waiting for me, for remembering, for giving me one more winter." Bruno licked her cheek, slow, tender. A final gesture from the cub he once was. Helen's breathing thinned. Her eyes drifted closed, and with her hand still tangled in his fur, she slipped peacefully out of the world. The room fell silent. Then Bruno lifted his head and released a sound that no one present would ever forget. A long, mournful bellow, not of anger, but of sorrow deep enough to shake the walls. It was grief in its most ancient form, a lament older than human language. He stayed beside her for hours, unmoving except for the occasional nudge against her still hand. No one tried to move him. No one would have dared. 3 weeks later, in the pale quiet of early morning, Bruno lay down in the same spot where Helen had passed. He curled his body as if to hold the memory of her close, and sometime before dawn he joined her. The official report listed kidney failure, but everyone who witnessed the bond between them knew the truth, that a bear can die of heartbreak just as surely as any human can. Spring found the park with a new memorial, 2 names carved side by side beneath a wooden carving of a bear cub pressed against a woman's hand. Bruno and Helen Ward, a bond beyond fear, time, and even death. And every visitor who paused to read it felt something stir inside them, the quiet knowing that love, no matter how improbable, never truly disappears. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Just leave a simple 1 in the comments to let me know you're here, or 0 if it brought you to tears. Your little message means more than you think. And if you'd like to join me for more true, soul-warming stories about humans and the animals who never forget us, please hit subscribe and stay with the channel. There are many more journeys waiting for you, and I'd be honored to share the next one together.